May 1st, 1960. It was dawn over Central Asia. The sky a cold blue, thin and endless. At 70,000 feet, the Earth curved gently below the wings of a silver needle. The Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. In its cramped cockpit sat Francis Gary Powers, a 30-year-old pilot, oxygen mask pressed to his face, instruments glowing in the dim light. His mission: fly across the Soviet Union, photograph missile sites, nuclear facilities, and airfields, then exit near Norway. The U-2 had been called untouchable, able to soar higher than any Soviet fighter or missile. But on that May morning, the Soviets were waiting. Below, radar stations tracked his every move. Along his projected path, surface-to-air missiles, SES-AMs, stood ready. At Sverdlovsk, batteries of the new SA-2 guideline system were locked on. At 8:53 local time, a missile arced upward into the thin atmosphere, followed by another, then another. Explosions ripped the sky around Powers. His aircraft shuddered violently. One wing sheared away. Instruments spun. The U-2, once serene in the stratosphere, became a tumbling coffin. Powers ejected, but too late. The canopy jammed. The plane broke apart, and he was thrown into open sky, parachute deploying just above the ground. As he drifted down, villagers stared upward. Soviet soldiers rushed to the field. The most secret American reconnaissance program was no longer secret. The man who had flown higher than any airline passenger would soon find himself in a Moscow prison cell. The world's cameras turned upon him. Washington would deny, then stumble. Moscow would rage, then parade its captive. The Cold War had found a new stage, not in Berlin or Korea, but in the skies. Drawn from declassified files, court records, and memoirs. This is the story of Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, shot down over the Soviet Union, and the tense prisoner swap that followed on the Glienicke Bridge. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? The U-2 program was born from fear. In the mid-1950s, the United States knew the Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb, but it did not know how many long-range bombers or missiles Moscow could field. American intelligence had little visibility beyond the Iron Curtain. Satellites did not yet exist. Aerial reconnaissance from conventional aircraft was suicidal. Soviet fighters could intercept them. President Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the stakes. If the Soviets had already deployed fleets of intercontinental bombers or missiles, the balance of power could tilt overnight. Without accurate intelligence, the U.S. risked either underestimating or overestimating the threat. Both were dangerous. Underestimation could mean vulnerability. Overestimation could mean panic, unnecessary escalation, and trillions spent on weapons America did not need. Enter the U-2. Designed by Kelly Johnson and his skunkworks team at Lockheed, the aircraft was an improbable machine, a jet-powered glider with wings that stretched nearly 100 feet, yet weighed barely enough to lift at thin altitudes. Its single engine propelled it above 70,000 feet, higher than any Soviet aircraft or missile of the mid-1950s. From that height, with cameras developed by Edwin Land's Polaroid team, it could capture images sharp enough to identify missile sites from 20 miles away. The U-2's missions were run jointly by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the U.S. Air Force. Civilian cover stories masked the program, with pilots sworn to secrecy. Flights began in 1956, crossing Soviet territory with stunning results. Photographs revealed bomber factories, missile test sites, nuclear reactors, data no other source could provide. The U.S. learned that the so-called bomber gap was largely myth, and the missile gap exaggerated. For a time, the U-2 reassured Washington and restrained alarmists. But the risk was monumental. Each flight violated Soviet airspace. If one were ever brought down, it would not be just an intelligence failure, but a diplomatic disaster. Eisenhower knew this. and as the 1960 Paris summit with Nikita Khrushchev approached, he debated halting the flights. The summit was intended to cool Cold War tensions, yet his advisors pressed. One more mission could capture decisive intelligence about Soviet missile deployments in the Urals. So, despite his misgivings, Eisenhower approved Operation Grand Slam, the deepest U-2 penetration yet, from Pakistan, across central Russia, to Norway. The pilot chosen was Francis Gary Powers, a former Air Force captain recruited by the CIA. Powers had flown U-2 missions before, logging hundreds of hours in the fragile, unforgiving aircraft. He knew the dangers. He also knew the plane had no weapons and no real defenses if tracked. His job was to rely on altitude and silence. In Moscow, the Soviets were not blind. They had tracked U-2 flights for years. Radar screens, painting slow-moving dots at impossible altitudes. Their frustration grew with each incursion. By 1960, they had deployed the SA-2 Guideline Surface-to-Air Missile, SAM, a system capable, at least on paper, of reaching the U-2's lofty altitudes. Thus, when Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in the pre-dawn hours of May 1st, Soviet radar operators were waiting, their screens lit up, batteries prepared. Khrushchev himself was informed in real time that the Americans had dared another intrusion, this time on May Day, the most sacred holiday in the Soviet calendar. It was, in his words, a slap in the face. Eisenhower's mandate had been to reduce fear by learning the truth. Powers' mission, however, would have the opposite effect. It would shatter trust, wreck the Paris summit, and plunge the Cold War into one of its bitterest confrontations. Flying the U-2 was unlike flying any other aircraft. Pilots called it the Dragon Lady because she was beautiful in the sky and brutal to handle. At 70,000 feet, the difference between stall speed and overspeed was razor thin, a margin of only a few knots known as the coffin corner. Drift too slow, and the aircraft would lose lift, fall into a stall, and spiral. Push too fast, and the thin air could not hold the wings against structural stress. Every U-2 flight was a balancing act between physics and fate. Francis Gary Powers knew this better than anyone. Recruited in 1956 from the U.S. Air Force, he trained under CIA command at secret facilities in Nevada. There, instructors drilled him on long endurance flights, sometimes 10 hours or more, while maintaining absolute stillness in the narrow coffin corner. The cockpit was pressurized, but failure meant unconsciousness in seconds. His flight suit included an oxygen supply, and strapped inside, a small silver coin with a poisoned pin. If captured, he was expected to use it. The U-2's cameras were its real weapons. The K.G.B camera, carried on Powers' mission, could photograph an area 25 miles wide, resolving details down to 3 feet from the edge of space. Shutter systems clicked at intervals, each frame a priceless slice of Soviet terrain. The film reels inside were as valuable as nuclear codes. If recovered intact by the Soviets, they would reveal exactly what America had been spying on. Powers also carried a destruct charge, a small explosive device meant to obliterate sensitive equipment in case of capture. The device was crude, and like the poison pin, it required a decision in seconds. Tradecraft was clear. Deny the Soviets usable evidence. In practice, it was far less simple. The Soviets had not been idle. By 1960, radar coverage blanketed their territory. Operators tracked U-2 flights as luminous arcs across their scopes, powerless to stop them in the early years, but furious at their persistence. The development of the SA-2 Guideline missile changed that. Deployed first around Moscow, then expanded across key military regions. The SA-2 could reach over 60,000 feet with a warhead that shredded the sky in a lethal cloud of shrapnel. For months before May 1960, Soviet crews drilled for the moment, Radar operators rehearsed tracking, missile units rehearsed launches, and MiG pilots practiced futile climbs toward the stratosphere. Power's flight path, Peshawar to Bodo, Norway, was long enough to guarantee exposure. When his U-2 crossed the Soviet frontier near Chelyabinsk, radar locks buzzed across the network. Tradecraft on both sides narrowed to seconds. On the ground, Soviet officers coordinated batteries across the Urals. In the sky, Powers adjusted trim, fuel flow, and altitude, eyes flicking from instrument to horizon. Knowing that radar had painted him, he believed the U-2 could outrun missiles. Its edge was altitude, but technology had caught up. The surveillance net that Powers entered was not just Soviet radar and missiles, it was political theater in waiting. Khrushchev had been briefed that if the Americans dared such a flight again, it must be answered. Orders were clear: bring the intruder down, whatever it took. For Powers, the mission felt routine, until it wasn't. Instruments hummed, cameras clicked, the steady pulse of the engine droned in his headset. Then warning lights flashed. A thud shuddered the fuselage. The Dragon Lady lurched. Soviet missiles had found her. At 8:53 local time on May 1st, 1960, a Soviet SA-2 missile detonated close to Powers' aircraft. The blast shredded the U-2's fragile frame. One wing ripped off, the tail snapped, and the cockpit spun end over end. Powers was slammed against his harness, his helmet rattling violently, the altimeter unwinding in a blur. He fought to regain control, but the aircraft was disintegrating. In training, pilots had been told to trigger the destruct charge and destroy sensitive equipment before ejecting. Powers hesitated. The violent spin pinned him against the fuselage. Reaching the charge was impossible. Worse, he feared that pulling it in that chaos might kill him outright. At around 34,000 feet, Powers unlatched the canopy and attempted to eject. The mechanism jammed. He forced his way out manually, the slipstream tearing at his flight suit. For an instant, he was tumbling in open sky. Then, with a jerk, his parachute deployed. Below, fields and villages spread out, Soviet soil rolling endlessly. Villagers spotted him descending. Soldiers were already rushing to the impact site. When Powers hit the ground, bruised but alive, they closed in with rifles. He was stripped of his gear and taken into custody. For the Soviets, it was triumph. Not only had they downed the invincible U-2, but the pilot was alive. His parachute carried him not to death, but to a Moscow cell. At the crash site near Sverdlovsk, Soviet troops found wreckage scattered across miles. To their astonishment, large portions of the U-2 remained intact. Cameras, film, instruments, even parts of the engine were recovered. Moscow suddenly had hard proof of American espionage, evidence that would be paraded before the world. In Washington, the CIA scrambled. Initial reports suggested Powers had not survived. Eisenhower's advisors crafted a cover story. An unarmed NASA weather aircraft had gone missing while flying over Turkey. Press releases claimed the pilot had likely lost consciousness from oxygen failure and drifted off course. For 24 hours, the story held. Then Khrushchev struck. On May 5th, he announced to the Supreme Soviet that a spy plane had been shot down over Soviet territory. He baited Washington, revealing only partial information, watching as U.S. officials repeated their weather plane denial. Then he revealed the truth. The pilot was alive, the wreckage intact, and the Americans had been caught lying. The propaganda coup was devastating. Eisenhower was forced to admit that the U.S. had authorized flights over Soviet soil. The Paris summit, scheduled for mid-May, collapsed in acrimony. Khrushchev berated Eisenhower, denouncing the flights as aggression. The American president, trapped between denial and candor, accepted responsibility, but defended the need for intelligence. Trust, already thin, disintegrated. For Powers, The propaganda campaign was personal. In Moscow, he was interrogated at Lubyanka prison. By the K.G.B, photographs of the wreckage were shown worldwide. His flight suit, helmet, even fragments of the U-2 were displayed in museums as proof of Soviet triumph. Powers himself was paraded in court, seated in a glass box, forced to confess to espionage before television cameras. He told the truth. He had been ordered to fly reconnaissance. He gave no operational secrets beyond what the Soviets already knew. But to the world, the trial painted him as the embodiment of American spying. In Washington, some accused him of failing to destroy the aircraft, failing to use the poison pin. Within the CIA, opinions split. Was he a survivor, or had he failed his final orders? The Soviets had their prize: a live pilot, a nearly intact aircraft, and America's credibility shaken. For the CIA, it was disaster. For the Cold War, it was a turning point. The sky was no longer safe. The Soviets understood immediately that the U-2 incident was not just a military success, but a political treasure. In Khrushchev's hands, it became a stage-managed performance designed to humiliate the United States and fracture trust in its leadership. The wreckage was carted to Moscow and laid out in exhibitions. Visitors, journalists, and foreign diplomats were shown the camera systems, fuel tanks, and pieces of fuselage. Each artifact was labeled proof of American aggression. The message was unmistakable. The U.S. was not a victim of paranoia, but a confirmed violator of sovereignty. Francis Gary Powers himself became a prop in this theater. At his trial in August 1960, held in Moscow's House of Trade Unions, he sat in a glass booth as prosecutors denounced him as a spy. The court presented photographs of the wreckage, diagrams of his flight path, and even the poison pin and silver dollar with a hidden compartment recovered from his gear. Powers, coached by lawyers and monitored by the K.G.B, acknowledged his orders but offered no operational secrets. He admitted what was undeniable: he had flown reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. The trial was broadcast internationally, feeding global skepticism about U.S. intentions. In Allied capitals, questions flared. Was Washington reckless? Could Eisenhower be trusted as a partner in peace? The Paris summit that had promised a thaw dissolved in acrimony. Khrushchev stormed out. Eisenhower was left isolated, and the Cold War's diplomatic temperature plunged. For Eisenhower, the incident was a personal blow. He had reluctantly approved the final mission, knowing the risks. Now he was portrayed as reckless, even duplicitous. In the final year of his presidency, his reputation as a careful strategist was tarnished. For the CIA, the embarrassment was worse. Its most secret program was no longer secret. Its ability to run clandestine operations was openly questioned in Congress. Economically, the Soviet propaganda victory was cheap. A handful of missiles, a trial, and staged exhibitions had destabilized U.S. credibility at a global scale. For Washington, the cost was immense, not in dollars, but in diplomacy. Allies had to be reassured, and intelligence programs recalibrated. The U-2 fleet was grounded for months. Plans for further overflights were shelved. Eisenhower turned his hopes to the future of satellites, which would soon provide reconnaissance without the risk of captured pilots. For Powers himself, the politics were harsher than the prison walls. In Moscow, he was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, 7 in labor camps. Internationally, he was cast both as a pawn and as a scapegoat. Some American commentators asked why he had not triggered the destruct charge or used the poison pin. Was he a coward or simply practical in a hopeless situation? The CIA, unable to defend him publicly, let those accusations linger. Moscow controlled the narrative. By parading Powers alive, they undercut Washington's early lies. By displaying the wreckage, they dismantled the weather plane cover story. By putting Eisenhower on the defensive, They scored a victory without firing another shot. The U-2 incident revealed the asymmetry of the Cold War's politics of control. The United States sought information to reduce uncertainty. The Soviets turned information into spectacle to increase it. Both sides won something. But Moscow's win was louder, sharper, and more visible to the world. The U-2 incident was not just a crisis. It was a turning point. In its wake, both superpowers recalibrated how they spied, how they projected strength, and how they handled the fragility of perception in a nuclear age. For the United States, the lesson was brutal. The illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. For 4 years, the U-2 had flown over Soviet territory without loss. Now, in one morning, the myth was gone. Eisenhower canceled further overflights. He knew the diplomatic cost of another capture would be intolerable. The U-2 remained in service, but never again would it cross the Soviet heartland. The replacement was already in motion. Even before May 1960, the CIA and the newly formed National Reconnaissance Office had been pursuing satellites as the future of intelligence. The Corona program, a series of photo reconnaissance satellites, launched its first successful mission in 1960, only months after Powers' capture. The U-2 incident accelerated the transition. Machines in orbit could not be paraded in court. They could not be interrogated on television. They could be denied. For the Soviets, the incident confirmed the value of their new missile systems. The SA-2 guideline became a symbol of deterrence. Exported to allies, it would later bring down American aircraft over Cuba and Vietnam. The destruction of Powers' U-2 became part of the missile's legend, proof that the skies could be contested. But the collapse went beyond machines. It touched the mythos of Cold War invulnerability. Eisenhower had entered the Paris summit, hoping for a legacy of cautious peace. Instead, he left humiliated, his credibility undermined in the eyes of Khrushchev and even his allies. The summit dissolved. The fragile optimism of spring 1960 curdled into recrimination. For Powers, the collapse was personal. In Lubyanka prison, he endured long interrogations. The K.G.B. pressed for secrets, but he held to his training, revealing little beyond what was already obvious from the wreckage. Still, he knew that back home, he was being judged. Each week that passed in Soviet custody deepened suspicions that he might have broken under pressure. He became a living symbol of doubt, a pilot who had survived but whose survival itself raised questions. The incident also revealed how thin the line was between espionage and open war. The Soviets had fired multiple SA-2 SAS, and one had accidentally downed a pursuing MiG-19, killing its pilot. In another moment, had Soviet defenses mistaken the launch for a U.S. first strike, escalation might have spiraled out of control. The U-2 incident exposed how fragile command and control really was when seconds determined survival. In the months that followed, the U.S. intelligence community regrouped. The CIA recognized that covert daring was no longer enough. Precision, deniability, and technological edge were paramount. Human pilots would remain valuable, but satellites would become the eyes of the Cold War. The U-2's downfall marked the collapse of one era, the age when altitude alone could guarantee safety. In its place rose an era where space, secrecy, and silence defined the future of espionage. For 21 months, Francis Gary Powers remained in Soviet custody. He was held first at Lubyanka prison, then in Vladimir Central Prison, a cold fortress east of Moscow that housed political prisoners. His cell was small, his days regimented. He endured interrogations, propaganda sessions, and endless solitude. The Soviets pressed him for confessions beyond what he had already given, but he remained careful, revealing little more than his mission parameters. Back in the United States, his captivity became both a rallying cry and a controversy. Public opinion was divided. Some saw him as a pawn of geopolitics. a man who had followed orders and paid the price. Others whispered he had failed in his final duties. He had not destroyed the U-2, not used the poison pin, not denied the Soviets their propaganda victory. In Washington's corridors, the CIA defended him quietly, but in public the silence was deafening. The turning point came in early 1962. Negotiations began between Washington and Moscow for an exchange. The Soviets held powers. The Americans held a man of equal or greater value, Colonel Rudolf Abel, a K.G.B. officer, arrested in New York in 1957 and convicted of espionage. Abel was a master spy, deeply prized by Moscow. A swap was proposed, powers for Abel. On February 10, 1962, the exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the so-called Bridge of Spies. Snow lay on the ground, the river below frozen in patches. At one end, Soviet and East German officials stood with Abel. At the other, American officers waited with powers. Slowly, under the watch of armed guards, the two men walked across the bridge. Cameras clicked, lenses fogging in the winter air. In the center, they passed each other in silence. Abel returned to the east, powers to the west. The Cold War had staged its most iconic prisoner swap. Powers' homecoming was not simple. Some hailed him as a survivor who had endured captivity. Others questioned his judgment, accusing him of weakness. Congressional hearings were held. The CIA conducted a quiet review of his conduct. Their conclusion was clear. Powers had followed orders, had not betrayed secrets, and had endured imprisonment honorably. But the shadow of suspicion lingered in the press. In later years, Powers struggled with the weight of his story. He worked as a test pilot, then later as a helicopter traffic reporter in Los Angeles. He defended himself in memoirs, insisting that survival had been his duty and that the poison pin had never been a realistic option. Over time, history grew kinder. In 2000, 43 years after his capture, he was posthumously awarded the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Silver Star for Valor. The U-2 incident itself became a touchstone of Cold War memory. It symbolized both the daring and the danger of espionage in the nuclear age, how one plane, one man, one mission could shatter diplomacy at the highest level. The wreckage of Powers' U-2 remains on display in Russia, a relic of Soviet triumph. The Glienicke Bridge, where he was exchanged, is now a monument to the strange theater of the Cold War. For Powers, the lesson was personal. He had been asked to fly higher than anyone before him, to stake his life on a machine that was meant to stay invisible. When the illusion broke, he endured capture, trial, and suspicion. Yet he returned with dignity intact. His story is a reminder that courage is not always found in glorious victories, but sometimes in survival itself. Today, the name Francis Gary Powers is remembered alongside the U-2, the SA-2 missile, and the Glienicke Bridge. His life was shaped by a single morning over Sverdlovsk, but his legacy is written into the history of how the Cold War was fought, not just with weapons, but with eyes in the sky, and with men willing to risk everything in the service of secrets.